Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you. You know, the United Nations is celebrating this major milestone at 80, and Gallup is actually celebrating a major milestone as well. We're celebrating our 90th birthday this year. And the benefit of Gallup celebrating its 90th year is that because our founder was so committed to innovation and creating new methods of tracking, we now can look back almost at the entire arc of the UN's history at how Americans feel about how the UN is doing. And after that, I want to say that we also got inspired recently. And if you can't tell, I'm a little nervous today because we're going to do something that's very un-Gallup, which is kind of let you into Gallup Labs. And before we launch something in the next couple of months, we're going to launch a preview of our results right here today. And so first, let me start by saying, how do Americans feel about the United Nations? So when George Gallup actually started doing this in about the 1950s, what he found is that when he boldly asked Americans, how do you think they're doing? A majority of Americans said, I think the UN's doing a pretty good job. Now, interestingly enough, Americans were a skeptical bunch, but if you look at the arc of history, that skepticism sort of remained for kind of the next 50 years. In fact, this is the arc as we progressed, and you'll see that there's some volatility in there. You'll see that there was a boost right after the Cold War, and you also see that this arc is measured by moments of global volatility. Moments like Rwanda, Iraq, Bosnia. You'll see that Americans looked more hopeful and felt like the UN was doing a good job. But if you look at this arc, there's also some things to be concerned about, because even despite today's political climate, you can see that Americans started to sour on how the UN is doing. In fact, today, there has been virtually no improvement, and 32% of Americans believe that the UN is doing a good job. Now, I was hoping to not fill you with total despair by the end of these remarks, because there are other questions that we ask, because I think some people see this and they think to themselves, well, does that mean that the US has given up on the United Nations? The answer is no. Because when we ask Americans, do you think the UN should exist? Does the promise still matter? 60% of Americans say, yeah, I think so. So this isn't about getting rid of the UN. It's that Americans believe in it. They just want it to do better. In fact, even when we ask Americans, do you think America should be a member? 80% believe that it should. So that's the current state of how Americans feel about the United Nations. But someone, potentially a colleague, someone at Concordia, said, Gallup, why are you just picking on Americans? Why ask the whole world how they feel about the United Nations? So that's what we did. And this is why I'm a little nervous, because in our 90-year existence, we take our time before we release things. And I don't know if it was Matt Swift, but said, let's just show them what you guys are doing at Gallup Labs. So we're going to show you today the first 40 countries that we have data on. And by the end of this report, we intend to have well over 100 countries where we ask them how they feel the UN is doing. Now, I want to first show you how we do this, because I think a lot of times people in a world of AI go, how does Gallup conduct surveys in all of these different countries? I think this might surprise you. Now, in wealthy countries, we still make phone calls. We are doing things like experimenting with AI, because collecting this information is really expensive. But I'll tell you why it's really expensive. Because when we go out and ask people, we don't want to just include people who are wealthy, who are educated. We want to make sure that everyone has an equal chance of participating in this particular survey. So I want to show you what it looks like. This is actually an interview that takes place. We conduct surveys in 140 countries every single year. Some of the information actually is used by the SDGs in order to inform progress, particularly on 4 of them. But here, in 100 countries, we interview people face to face. We actually spend about 45 minutes to an hour with those individuals. You can see that sometimes we actually participate in those interviews. This is one in Ulaanbaatar that I was lucky enough to participate in. Now we throw that out. If there's a guy from the US that sits in during those interviews, it doesn't make it to the end, but it allows us to get qualitative information. Because if they express enthusiasm or disappointment in the United Nations, we can say back to them, can you say more about why? What is it that you expect from the UN? To help us think a little bit more about how we can be helpful in our analysis to those that are consuming this information. Okay, so now that you know that, we do anticipate that we will have information breaking at the beginning of next year, but so far we have data from 40 different countries. And from those 40 different countries, here's what the data are. So as I mentioned before, the results from the United States, 32% of Americans feel like the UN is doing a good job. But when we ask the entire world how they feel, this is a little bit more inspiring. Right now, the world, in terms of their attitudes about the UN, half say that they approve of the job performance of the leadership of the United Nations. Now, of the 40 countries that we looked at, when you break them out, look at them individually, that's where things get most interesting. Here, out of the 40 that we've looked at so far, are the top four countries and the bottom four countries for the entire world. I'm going to start with the ones that came in at the bottom. And now I'll show you the countries that came out on top. Now, the most immediate observation is when you look at the 40 countries that we've analyzed so far, the countries who give the highest percent of favorability toward the UN are countries that are typically known for receiving development assistance. They give the highest scores. But the countries who give the worst scores, you'll notice Israel, Palestine, Ukraine. Two other countries that aren't far behind in these rankings here, Armenia and Libya. Countries that are in conflict typically give the UN its lowest scores. Now, there's one last observation when we're looking at demographic cuts, because I think you might say that maybe this is the UN's unlikely constituency. I think some might say that there's a perception of those that are here convening that maybe they're upper income, maybe they're higher educated, maybe they dominate from wealthy countries. And so who is it that gives them their highest approval ratings? Interestingly enough, when we look at every single demographic variable, the groups that do are those that are in rural communities, that are the least educated, and when we ask about subjective income, those that give the worst scores in terms of their income, saying that they're really struggling to get by, give the UN the highest marks. And lastly, although this is not an overwhelming mandate from the world at 50%, the group that is actually pulling up the UN's approval ratings the most is when you look at age. And so this last slide that I want to share with you is when you break it by generation. Because right now, across the 40 countries that we've looked at, every single age group, with the exception of one, comes in below the 50% mark. But there's one group that still has hope, one group that will one day run all the institutions where we work, which is the youngest. Right now, young people say that international cooperation is something that they still believe in. And that one day when they run the UN, hopefully this continues, and that they still feel this way as they progress. I want to say thank you to Concordia for letting us share this information. One of the things at Gallup is that our mission, something that our founder was passionate about, is that if you want to help people, it's not necessarily about doing what they say, but you always need to know what they're thinking. And so this gives us an opportunity to share the voices of the millions, if not billions of people that are represented by these data. I look forward to sharing this report breaking next year when we get over 100 countries in it, and thank you again for your interest in Gallup. Thank you.